They had the suspects, they had the charges, they had one of the most powerful national security laws in the British legal arsenal ready to deploy. And then, in a moment that should alarm anyone who cares about how democracies protect themselves, the entire case collapsed. Not because the evidence evaporated, not because the accused were proven innocent, but because the government of the United Kingdom refused to say three simple words. China is a threat. Christopher Cash and Christopher Barry, two British men accused of spying for Beijing under the Official Secrets Act, walked free in January 2025, not because justice was served, but because justice was quietly suffocated by political convenience. And what we're witnessing here isn't just a failed prosecution. It's a masterclass in how Western governments sacrificed national security on the altar of trade deals and diplomatic niceties. Let's be crystal clear about what happened here, because the implications are staggering. Cash was a parliamentary researcher, someone with access to the corridors of power, working for Conservative MP Alicia Kearns, who chaired Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. Barry was an academic researcher based in China, and according to prosecutors, between late 2021 and February 2023, these two men allegedly provided information or documents to Beijing that could be useful to an enemy and prejudicial to the safety or interests of the United Kingdom. That's not minor stuff. That's textbook espionage, the kind of betrayal that nations have historically treated with the utmost severity. They were charged in April 2024. The case was built, the trial was approaching, and then, just weeks before it was set to begin, everything fell apart. Why? You ask. Here's where it gets truly absurd. Stephen Parkinson, Britain's Director of Public Prosecutions, sent a letter to Parliament explaining the collapse, and his explanation should make your blood run cold. He said that no one from the government, not a single official, was willing to testify that at the time of the alleged offenses, China represented a threat to national security. Read that again. The government wouldn't confirm that China was a threat. Now, under the Official Secrets Act, prosecutors needed to prove the defendants were acting for an enemy. Without a government witness willing to use that classification, the legal foundation crumbled. Parkinson's team tried for months to get someone, anyone, to step up and provide this testimony. But the Starmer administration stonewalled them. The case couldn't proceed, so it didn't. Let's pause here and consider the sheer madness of this situation. Britain's own MI5 domestic intelligence agency has been screaming about the China threat for years. The head of MI5, Ken McCallum, publicly named China, Russia, and Iran as the leading security threats to the UK. In 2023, he told the BBC that tens of thousands of people in Britain had been approached by Chinese spies. He called it an espionage campaign on a pretty epic scale. Those are his words. Pretty epic scale. Parliament's own Intelligence and Security Committee labeled Beijing a strategic threat in 2023, not a challenge, not a competitor, a threat. The intelligence community knows it. Parliament's security experts know it. Anyone paying attention to Chinese espionage operations across the Western world knows it. But when prosecutors needed someone to say it under oath, to make it official in a courtroom, suddenly everyone developed amnesia. Now here's where the political gymnastics get really creative. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, whose Labour government took power in 2024, has been trying to reset relations with China after years of tension over spying allegations, human rights abuses, China's support for Russia's war in Ukraine, and Beijing's crackdown on freedoms in Hong Kong. Britain's top diplomat visited Beijing. The Treasury chief made the trip. Starmer himself is expected to travel to China. And in this new diplomatic climate, Labour has carefully downgraded China from a threat to a strategic challenge, as if changing the vocabulary changes the reality of Chinese espionage operations. When asked about the collapsed case, Starmer threw the Conservative Party under the bus. He argued that you can't prosecute someone for actions taken years ago based on a designation that wasn't in place at the time. He pointed out that when the Conservatives were in power during the alleged spying period, they hadn't officially classified China as a threat either. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called China's growing authoritarianism an epic defining challenge, carefully avoiding the T-word that many in his own party wanted him to use. So Starmer's position is essentially this: blame the previous government for not making the designation. We can't fix their mistake retroactively. Case closed, move along. But here's the problem with that excuse. It's complete nonsense. First, the law doesn't require a formal governmental designation of threat to exist in some official register. It requires evidence that the entity in question posed a danger to national security, which could be established through intelligence assessments, expert testimony, and the mountain of public warnings that British security services have been issuing about China for years. Second, If the issue was really about the conservative government's failure to make a formal designation during their time in office, then why did prosecutors charge these men in April 2024, months before Labour took power, presumably? The Crown Prosecution Service believed they had a viable case under existing law. So what changed? What changed was political will. Conservative MP Alicia Kearns, who worked directly with Cash when she chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee, isn't buying the government's explanation. She demanded answers, asking who was responsible for spiking the prosecution. She said the government must come clean, and she warned that continued stonewalling only invites concern about concealment or conspiracy. Those are serious accusations from someone who knows the inner workings of Parliament's security apparatus. Critics outside government are even more blunt. Luke de Pulford, executive director of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, an international group focused on Beijing's rising power, called this a clear example of UK officials trading away our national security. And he's not wrong. Think about the precedent this sets. Britain just told China, and every other adversarial power watching, that even when we catch you red-handed, even when we charge your spies under our most serious national security laws, we might just drop the case if prosecuting it becomes diplomatically inconvenient. That's not deterrence. That's an invitation. And let's talk about what this means for the people working in British intelligence and law enforcement. Imagine being an MI5 officer spending years building cases against Chinese espionage networks, gathering evidence, identifying assets, watching as your superiors publicly warn about the epic scale of the threat, and then seeing the government refuse to back up those warnings when it actually matters. When there's a chance to hold someone accountable in court, what message does that send? It tells intelligence professionals that their work is disposable, that national security is negotiable, that when push comes to shove, trade relationships matter more than counterintelligence victories. Now, Cash and Barry deny any wrongdoing. They're entitled to that presumption. And the Chinese embassy predictably called the allegations fabricated and dismissed them as malicious slander. But here's the thing. We'll never know the truth now, because the case never went to trial. The evidence was never tested in court. Witnesses were never cross-examined. The public never got to see what prosecutors had or didn't have. Instead, we got a quiet collapse and a bureaucratic explanation that raises more questions than it answers. And this isn't happening in isolation. This is part of a broader pattern across Western democracies where economic entanglement with China creates a political paralysis when it comes to confronting Chinese state activity. Whether it's espionage, intellectual property theft, influence operations, or political interference, governments talk tough in press releases, intelligence agencies issue warnings, parliamentary committees write reports, but when it comes time to actually impose costs, to prosecute, to expel diplomats, to ban companies, to take actions that might upset Beijing and jeopardize trade deals, suddenly everyone gets cautious. Suddenly there are complications. Suddenly the lawyers discover problems. Britain imported over £60 billion worth of goods from China in recent years. Chinese investment flows into British infrastructure, universities, and technology sectors. And for politicians trying to boost economic growth, especially in the post-Brexit landscape, maintaining access to Chinese markets feels essential. So when presented with a choice between prosecuting alleged spies and preserving diplomatic relations that facilitate trade, they chose commerce. This is the fundamental corruption at the heart of how Western nations are responding to authoritarian challenges in the 21st century, not corruption in the sense of brown envelopes and secret payments, but corruption in the sense of a system that has lost the ability to defend its own core interests because those interests conflict with short-term economic calculations. And the cruelest irony, Beijing doesn't operate under these constraints. China doesn't hesitate to arrest foreign nationals on espionage charges, often on flimsy or non-existent evidence. It doesn't worry about offending Western sensibilities when it cracks down on dissent or pursues what it perceives as threats to the Communist Party's control. Chinese authorities act decisively to protect what they define as their national interests, and they do it without apology. Meanwhile, Britain, home of MI6, birthplace of modern intelligence tradecraft, the nation that broke Enigma and ran some of the most sophisticated espionage operations of the 20th century, can't even get a government official to say in court that its primary geopolitical rival poses a security threat. If you're in Beijing watching this unfold, you're not worried, you're laughing. The collapse of this case is a gift to every Chinese intelligence officer operating in the UK. It's a signal that the risk-reward calculation just shifted dramatically in their favor. It tells assets and potential recruits that even if they're caught, political factors might save them. It demonstrates that Britain's commitment to counterintelligence is conditional, subject to the priorities of whatever government happens to be in power, and perhaps most damaging, It erodes public trust in the entire national security apparatus. If intelligence services warn about threats, but governments won't act on those warnings, if prosecutors build cases, but politicians won't support them, then what's the point? Why should citizens trust official assessments of danger if those assessments evaporate the moment they become inconvenient? This is how democracies lose, not through military defeat, but through 1,000 small acts of cowardice, through the gradual acceptance that principles are flexible, that security is negotiable, that standing up to authoritarian powers is simply too expensive or too complicated. The two men accused of spying may be innocent. We may never know, but what we do know with certainty is that the British government was unwilling to defend the integrity of its own prosecution, unwilling to support its intelligence services assessments, unwilling to prioritize national security over diplomatic relations with a regime that its own security chiefs have identified as a primary threat. That's not justice. That's capitulation dressed up in legal language, and it should terrify anyone who understands that the contest between open societies and authoritarian states will be won or lost not on battlefields, but in moments exactly like this, when governments must choose between what's expedient and what's necessary. Britain chose expedience, and in doing so, it sent a message that will echo far beyond this one collapsed case. It told the world that when it really matters, when the choice is between security and commerce, between principle and profit, between standing firm and bending the knee, it will bend, and every intelligence service from Beijing to Moscow to Tehran is taking notes.